All right. Thank you, everyone, for waiting. Welcome. We are live with Revolutionary Strategy Part 3. And we have ourselves a merry little panel here. We have Grant coming back from Swamp Side. Now, Grant was in the emancipation stuff before, but is now dipping their feet back in. So, welcome.
Hello, Lexi. Good to be here.
Yeah. Of course, we have the immortal Tom O'Brien, Chief Officer Tom O'Brien from Alpha to Omega.
Yeah, Commandante Alpha here. How's it going? My internet connection's bad, so Lexi's leading.
That's right. We have the lovely and talented Sophia from Trans Revolution back again.
Hi, Sophia, representing the gay space communist sect.
That's right. And joining us for the first time today is Dan. Dan from the, well, I know Dan as a Swamp Side listener and patron, a loyal Bonapartist follower. But Dan, I think, can introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Dan. I guess I don't have official affiliations other than I was once a member of the DSA Refoundation Caucus. Yeah.
Now, I did want to ask a little bit about the DSA Refoundation Caucus because when we were talking about it a little bit before, it sounded like it was a sort of micro left unity effort. And as we know, the subtitle of this book is The Challenge of Left Unity. And part of the critique that we've been building in the last couple episodes is this idea of what's wrong with left unity. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so Refoundation was an attempt to get some sort of left unity inside DSA off the ground of just people who agreed broadly that they were Marxists and agreed on some tactical principles, like we should do base building, we should do left unity, obviously, we should do political education. But those differences sort of never got addressed openly. So you had this organization with just like Maoists and Trotskyists and a few McNairists and some open, just non-denominational socialists. And because they never got addressed, they sort of boiled underneath the surface and would become issues at times when you had to take like crucial decisions. So without that like open political discussion, it just produced a lot of internal tension, and like not very much ever actually got done in the organization aside from just people doing things in their communities.
Yeah, there's a sort of like parallel we were making, I think, a couple episodes ago to the left unity effort in the United Kingdom that this book was written in the context of, and how the Weekly Worker for, I think it was about a year. Tom called it without even looking it up, but it's about a year of coverage in the Weekly Worker of just all the miserable like shit slinging that was happening between these sects trying to hide their differences and vie for power. And it lasts about a year and fizzles the fuck out. And I don't know, like we're all looking at this in our like, I guess most of us are in the United States, but Tom, of course, is not. There's a sort of, I don't know. We got into this idea of where the Marxist Center, the organization, the US, was getting its idea of center from. And from talking to organizers within it, I had this idea that they were getting it more from the scholar Hal Draper. Whereas, you know, if you're a McNairist, you have an obvious idea of what the center is that is maybe different. But as we were talking about before, like, it's a bit scrambled, actually, for the context of the United States. Like, I don't know if we really, like, laid out perfectly what the difference between these things is. And I think it'll become relevant as we're sussing it out. Does anyone else want to take this?
Well, perhaps we should read the Hal Draper quote that you read off air so that we're all on the same page about what exactly we're talking about with like Hal Draper's version of left unity.
Yeah, it's sort of Hal Draper's version of the center, I suppose, is what he calls the political center. So I'll read a couple of quotes from the 1973 pamphlet, Anatomy of the Microsect. So what should be done to prepare the ground for the eventual formation of a socialist movement / party in America? That is a mass-based socialist formation, which is the political expression of the working class moving towards a collision with the established powers of capitalist society. Let's see. We first address ourselves to the individual socialist who wonders what he or she should do and can do other than join the sect of his choice and waste his energies in the vicissitudes of sect life. You have the opportunity for undertaking a two-sided socialist enterprise keyed to your own circumstance. We suggest the following double-barreled liaison for you, both sides of which are necessary for the whole thing to be meaningful. 1. Your basic contribution to the eventual formation of a socialist movement is what you do to develop a socialist circle around you, where you are now. We are thinking in the first place of your role in the workplace, factory, office, school, or whatever. First things first, what the American working class needs, first of all, is the crystallization of an organized militant opposition in the trade unions, etc. This opposition must be a loyal opposition, etc. And so the second criterion is, but the role of a political center need not be carried by a sect. Historically, this job has been done most often and most successfully by a paper or other publication of a socialist political center, which is organized simply as an editorial board or other editorial enterprise. Iskra was only one of dozens of examples of how this was done as socialist movements came into existence all over the world, Iskra being the Russian social democratic newspaper that Lenin worked for. Historically also, political centers of this sort have frequently undertaken organizing functions as their influence spread, the organizing being the product or byproduct of the work of its agents and representatives. The point would be utterly lost if these enterprises were considered merely literary enterprises in the usual bourgeois sense. There's a continuous line which has carried such political centers from their functions as producers of literature to their role as centers for the stimulation of organization, one form or another. We mention them not to celebrate their work necessarily, but to exhibit alternatives to the sect road. And so he later summarizes his advice for the individual socialist who wants to, quote, do something as follows. 1, crystallize a circle of co-thinkers around you wherever you are. In the course of your activity in the arena of the social struggle that goes along with your situation, you are the smallest unit political center there is. And then 2, make contact with a political center that makes sense from your point of view for help in literature, advice, link-ups, and yada yada. You'll use your money and, I'm sorry, what is this? You'll use your money not for the sect's fund drives, but to finance your own work. If enough take this course to break up the sect system, that would be a good thing for the future potentialities of an American socialist movement. So that's a lot.
Okay.
But let's discuss this.
So can you hear me? Is my mic coming through okay?
Sounds great.
Okay. So if you were looking at that, it sounds quite different from what Marxism Center sounds like to me. It looks like Marxism Center is more of a kind of a project, in that they're looking for a joining of sects and a kind of a snowball effect. Does that sound like I've got it correct? Not what they say, but how you would diagnose it from the outside.
I don't know. Like, it seems like, I guess from the outside, it looks like it sort of kind of has this character of attempting to do a left unity project, but I think if we're talking about like a neo-Trotskyist like organization, I don't think it fits that. Does that make sense?
Vaguely, it does make sense, but like, I guess, what makes this different from a normal left unity effort? And I guess I would only qualify that McNair wants a specific kind of left unity effort that maybe, maybe there's the points of unity process, you could say, if you're a defender of Marxist center, would have been like a McNair inspired, like, attempt maybe. Like, even though other left unity efforts do points of unity, and McNair is critical of those, everyone was doing these points of unity, or at least a lot of them were doing points of unity with the idea of principled programmatic unity in mind, although no such program has emerged.
I think like what distinguishes them perhaps from this like McNairist view is it seems like they're using their points of unity to get like a kind of tactical unity, where they're using the same tactics to organize the class more than they are in a type of unified program. Like, it seems like the points of unity are just a way for them to get to a point where they can function in the same organization as each other rather than develop their political line.
Right. It seems politically instrumental more than a really principled stake of like what Marxism is about.
But that's different than what Dan is saying. And thank you for clarifying my mistake there, Dan, because for a moment there I was like, what is the difference between Marxist center and what McNair wants? McNair is less interested in the base building. McNair is interested in building an institution so that once the class gets going, they can do something with a long-term or some kind of resource that's there, that was built when the struggle wasn't hot.
Is that what he's saying?
Ultimately, like, I think he thinks that there needs to be a working class party that can make something of class struggle once it reaches a height. Like, and he thinks that this needs to be built up over a long-term, horizon, revolutionary patience.
I think in practice, every McNairist project I've been involved with, and I think McNair is smart. He kind of runs into the limits of being a Marxist wonk in my view, but he's a great critic. But positively speaking, every McNairist project I've been involved with has hit these limits of I don't think that these projects are trying to do that exactly, where they're trying to make something that would be productive for the proletariat to take over. Like, what use would the proletariat have taking over, I don't know, Red Party back when that existed, or taking over like Marxist center, even if it reaches its ideal goals? I think that these political sects develop such perverse incentives that they become these warped sectarian organizations that wouldn't really be useful for a resocialized emergent proletarian movement to take. I think that that's going to want to develop its own organizations.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, like, what is it about these sects then, do you think, that are deleterious to that?
Well, I think a lot of them are so concerned with the internals of the left and run into the limits of politics as an alienated sphere, where people are asking, what can I do? What can I do? Like, capitalism's not producing organic struggle in the proletariat enough. And they jump into these sectarian internal political left projects instead of, even Draper is saying, kind of look around yourself and see what are your social interests and what are the social interests of your circles, because early unions may have had socialists involved, but they also had the involvement of the people who they advance the interests of. And when you're instrumentally just doing a project to build the left, I think that it undermines its ability to generate a social base.
So instead of creating a union to build the left, it should be creating a union to get a material benefit to people, and thus that will in itself build the left more so than this kind of building the left for left's sake.
I don't want to turn this into the anti-politics podcast. I have questions about the value of the left as like a place where politics axiomatically defines itself as emancipatory. And when you look at the 20th century, how that has turned out, and like how Marxism should associate itself with the left. But I think that can maybe go beyond this discussion.
Well,
Yeah.
this is actually, if we ever get to the chapter, it basically lays out what Marxist politics is in the broadest strokes, or at least what McNair considers, historically speaking, situated in like the First International, where you had the Bakuninists, the people following Bakunin and like anarchists on the left, and you had the Lassalleans, the people that wanted to make a sort of alliance with the aristocracy against the bourgeoisie and have state funding for their movement, more or less. Like, what ended up in that center? In a way, there's an even broader center of socialist strategy outside Marxism, and Marxism is the center of that, if you really want to get obnoxious about it.
Okay, well, like, before we go there, I'd like to say something just about I think I'd like to say something about the existing groups, the existing type of left sects, and their kind of obsession with the Soviet Union or Mao or Cuba. And I was saying to off air that I think that like anything that smells of any of the 20th century bad what would you say?
Actually,
errors.
Socialism.
Actually existing
tragedies.
socialism. Yeah. Will immediately turn somebody off. And that if we are to think about, say, this book and Marxism as in any way, not just some kind of LARPing for the left, we have to think about how do you get a mass party to build. And for me, the minute you have pictures of Lenin, a star, a sickle and a hammer, any of this stuff, the minute you start like talking about 1917 in a way that's not purely educational, it just smells so bad to the man on the street or the woman on the street. It's an instant turn off. And the one thing I was saying to people before the show started, like, if you ask like liberal Americans, right, and you ask them, do you think like during the Cold War all the fascists that were put in power in South America were like, it kind of that was necessary, that's something that you should defend? Like, they probably, whether they'll want to admit it or not, would probably a large portion will say yes. But we don't see like the Democratic or the Republican Party or any Western political parties of any major note putting like phalangist or Nazi symbols in their literature, or ever talking about fascism and how it had its good and its bad points. Just politically, to me, it's just cyanide. I don't know if I want to just park it there. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything or whether we should move on.
Well, I think I wanted to kind of bring it to the text a little bit, but also kind of picking it back off of what Tom was talking about, because to me, in like the McNairist sense of like the left wing and the right wing of socialism, they're kind of the inverse of each other in this question of like Soviet defensism, right? Like, so you have anarchists and maybe some council communists on the left who are going so ham about Stalinism like it's some actually existing threat, right? And what I tell them is that no, like, you'll never see Stalinism in America. You probably will never see Stalinism in any Western bourgeois democracy. Like, it's just not going to happen. And being so afraid of like some kind of authoritarian communist regime rising up is just ridiculous and kind of childish in my mind. But at the same time, for people who go ham about defending these regimes, I honestly want to tell them the same thing. Like, there's no point to defending ghosts. You know what I mean? Like, sure, let's educate people about what these movements were, and there is a lot of value in studying the history. But beyond that, defending these things that don't exist and have failed is nothing but a turnoff to most working Americans. And so to me, like, that kind of does fit a little bit with this like left, right, center schema. That's about all I have to say.
Yeah, and I think that gets to the fact that, you know, Stalinists, peasant Marxism doesn't have a social base in the United States, and that's something that has made one of the reasons that Maoism and Stalinism and even Leninism fall flat on their face to a lot of people is that they seem kind of anachronistic in a lot of our context. But I think also something about what Tom was saying, you know, personally, I have a Soviet flag in my room, maybe, but I think that imagery is produced by struggle. And so much of the left clings to this old imagery because they're more concerned with the internals of the left than whatever sporadic class activity we've seen in the 21st century so far, like 15M, or now, you know, this isn't exactly mass activity, but it's got a class component in the yellow vests. But also extant activity is low. So of course we're seeing a lack of imagery, because I think it's class struggle that creates new imagery and new forms.
Yeah, I think that's a major point. That, you know, to cling to these ones, it's like, you know, it's archaic. You might as well be going around with, you know, a cross, you know, or it's like ancient religious symmetry. Imagery. I just went and had a look at what are Pademas's and Syriza's imagery, the two kind of European ones that took off, you know, radical left parties that took off. You know, there's not any old imagery involved in there. Even the colors, you know, I'm not making a case for either of them as parties. I'm just saying, you know, anything that sniffs of Stalin or anything like this. The reason why, say, Syriza took off versus, say, the Communist Party took off, you know, in Greece, probably a lot of that has to do with that idea of the smell. But I really like Grant's idea of the imagery will come from the struggle. You know, when we looked at Occupy threw up some great imagery. They did like a funky new version of, like, you know, that iconic Tiananmen Square guy standing in front of the tank. They had some really good imagery at the time. I remember thinking and saying, like, God, that's really good. And it has to come, you know, it has to be like something that comes organically out of it. And we should be thinking and getting artists and stuff working on that stuff.
I think there's an extent to which also, I don't want to go too deep into this psychoanalytic mode, but where this defensism is evidence of this like anxiety about the possibility for socialism, in a similar way to like how someone like David Graeber puts a lot of emphasis on like quote unquote primitive communism as an evidence that it's possible. I think there's a similar thing going on there with Soviet defensism, where it's a lot less terrifying of a prospect than, you know, realizing that we have to jump off into the void of the future and create something new.
Yeah, I think this is something that the communizers, they're kind of like Marxian ways or Marxist ways of framing, you know, what McNair would call, you know, Bakunanism, essentially. But you know, they're actually very insightful on this thing. Like, they also seem to believe that class unity is blocked, and so what we get instead are these sort of you know, fictive unities, these like placeholders that will take the name. So like in Occupy, it would have been the 99%. You know, in Spain, it's the Indignados, and you know, in France right now, it's the Yellow Vests. It's these symbolic rolling, like, you know, hashtag kind of things that that you sort of fight for. And in a weird way, there was a Commune article that was talking about the Yellow Vests recently. It parallels the way that the nation worked in the old Paris Commune. I don't know if they're making that point like specifically, but somebody pointed out, oh, you know, they're kind of being soft on nationalism and the way that the nation figures into these yellow vest riots, or the yellow vest protests. But look at Marx's description of the Paris Commune. He is talking about something that was wrestling a class character into the language of the nation. So this is not alien to Marxism, and very probably when we're dealing with class unity, it's going to be mediated through these other cultural factors.
I wanted to say one more thing on this topic, and then kind of go to the text. But I guess in my mind, I view I don't know what you would think of the vanguard or the political left, as Grant has talked about, as kind of playing a role of building institutions, because I think you need both the spontaneous class-based movement as well as left to build institutions for them to plug into so that they don't just sputter out. And I think this concept also applies to symbols too, because I think if it's just left to pure spontaneity, it gets stuck in this kind of left populist framework. And I think Occupy is a case in point. It got so stuck in this 99% framework, which is, to me, wildly inaccurate and includes way too many people who I would consider to be class traders, or people who are petit bourgeois who have no interest in any kind of revolutionary change. And I think that that's problematic. So I think, but I think the problem with left politicos, if you will, is that they are too attached to old symbols, and instead of saying hey, let's create a new symbol together that's more meaningful than just simply the 99%, that they just want to throw around hammer and sickles. But it looks like Grant wants to say something about Occupy, but we really should get to the text after that.
I would just say that I think Occupy's limits show this the limits of being politically funneled by the left into that kind of BS rhetoric, if anything. I think that came, and a lot of the problems of Occupy came from this weird layer of civil social leadership wannabe politico class type people putting forward these. I think that it's Occupy is interestingly mixed in how quickly it got leftized, but then there were positive elements as well. But I guess I shouldn't distract us too much from the text. Let's go on.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're right ultimately, and I think as socialists, we need to try to push out these kind of liberal civil servant kind of people. But yeah, let's move on to the text.
Okay. Just say no to the Lisa Simpson form. All right. So Marxism as a political platform. Who wants to start this? Tom, did you want to cut in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if my internet connection is better, I don't mind taking over if you want. I don't know. There was just a pause. That's all I was going to say.
No. I got up to get something, but I'm back. So we got Marxism as a political platform as so he uses the French Workers' Party draft that Marx does with this guy, Jules Guesde. I mention him only because there was a dispute in the French Workers' Party, or between the two of them, about what the meaning of that program was. Marx was dead serious about all the reforms in it, and Guesde was just sort of doing it because he thought, this would, once the workers see these things fail, then they'll become revolutionary. But this really draws out what is special about Marx. So very concisely expressed in the preamble of the 1880 program of the Parti Ouvrier, drafted by Marx, is this. That the emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex or race, that the producers can be free only when they are in possession of the means of production, land, factories, ships, banks, credit, that there are only two forms under which the means of production can belong to them. One, the individual form, which has never existed in a general state and is increasingly eliminated by industrial progress. Two, the collective form, the material intellectual elements, which are constituted by the very development of capitalist society. And this collective appropriation can arise only from the revolutionary action of the productive class or proletariat organized in a distinct political party. That such an organization must be pursued by all the means the proletariat has at its disposal, including universal suffrage, which will thus be transformed from the instrument of deception that it has been until now into an instrument of emancipation. So that's the core. He says that this builds off of the stuff from the Communist Manifesto, but then adds this additional element that the proletariat must be organized in their own distinct party, which, although sometimes it is thought to be the implication of the Communist Manifesto, since it's the manifesto of the Communist Party that is, put out by this little communist league. It is never specifically stated. And in fact, at the end of the Communist Manifesto, they kind of waffle on it. So this is probably the most important, advocation of a distinct party. But it should be said that party doesn't mean to them what it means to us exactly. We'll get into that later.
Okay, well, why don't we discuss about what they thought about the party? Seems like a good place to start if we're going to talk about what Marx thought.
Yeah, so he even says this: to call a party Marxist does not in the least entail that it should be, for example, a Trotskyist party, a party which held to the strategic line of Kautsky's road to power, without the political conclusions of Kautsky's theoretical statism and nationalism, which flowered more fully in his later work, would still be a Marxist party. And I'm not sure if there's a footnote about this, but I guess it's most important to state that, first of all, obviously, the whole concept of the Leninist party didn't exist. I think that should be the most obvious thing. But when people think of a Marxist party, a lot of them are thinking of that. Now, on the other hand, a mass party is also something that's still kind of forming. And in a lot of ways, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, is kind of one of the prototypical European parties. There's definitely parties beforehand, but there's never been a mass party quite like the SPD.
Is he thinking? Is he thinking also along the lines of the Chartists in England? Yeah,
he's thinking something a little broader and a little looser than even the mass parties that we're thinking of.
Well, can you elaborate on what you mean by mass party, and also maybe compare and contrast that to what Marx meant by party here, so that we're clear on this?
Yeah. The problem with this question is that party before basically around the time of where Marx dies, is not as concrete. It's basically more like tendency. It's more like talking about a tendency. And it was so-called parties. They were so-called parties because they were sort of like groups of people that were chilling together. I mean, that sounds dumb, but it's kind of true. Whereas the mass party of an SPD is expecting they want a mass membership. They want to build a base for their party.
So it's more is it more of a movement?
Yeah, the hope is which more of a movement? Sorry,
the sense in which Marx calls party is like a movement.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's more of more.
Is also somewhat, I guess maybe in Marx's younger life, the predominant form of political organization was clubs. I think the most famous of which is the Jacobin Club, which many political organizations partner themselves after. These semi-secretive, not very public political organizations, which were not really able to be mass parties, and had usually a very sort of hierarchical structure in a way that later parties like the SPD wouldn't. Or at least they wouldn't have the same type of sort of secret hierarchy.
So I guess my thought in regards to like what a party is, and I think this might be one of those ways in which we could say that we perhaps have sharpened our analysis since the times of Marx, meaning that perhaps like we need a more concrete idea of what a party is, and part of what we're kind of debating now is that like what is a better formation for a party, like a mass party, the kind of Marxist-Leninist party that's very centralized, the kind of Jacobin style of party that Dan was talking about, or political clubs. And so perhaps we should, discuss this a little bit further, like what, or maybe, I don't recall if he actually gets into this later in the book, but if he doesn't, then perhaps we should discuss it. Like, what is the best form of a modern party if Marx's idea was a bit too nebulous and of its time?
Well, I would argue
Gets into it a little later in the chapter.
I would argue that McNair neglects the question of whether a party is premature, or at least to call an organization a workers' party, it would be a workers' party in name only in the present day.
Well, right. I guess to kind of like elaborate on this, I do think the idea that we see some organizations take of like having pre-party formations, I think theoretically is good. Perhaps the way that they're executed has some flaws.
Right, and I'm not saying you're being premature so much as I think McNair leaves very little room for the possibility that the proletariat needs to get a sense of itself in some way, or something without the guy before these kinds of party formations can be relevant.
Yeah, that's true, and I think one thing that we need to also think about too is that like forming a party, especially a political party in the United States, is a very different task than it is in parliamentary bourgeois democracies. We can form a political party and even like have some degree of officiality, but it's not going to really do anything. It's going to be way less effective, and it's already very ineffective in a lot of cases in European parliamentary democracies. But in the United States, it's almost pointless in some ways. Like I think there is a potential for like running, troll candidates and doing kind of like an electoral propaganda of the deed to be oppositional, and I think that's fine. But I think anything more than that, you're going to run into a lot of problems. And I think I almost prefer the kind of idea of like what McNair would later call like a party of activists, that in like the sense of like the Black Panther Party. I think that almost is a better idea of it, even if you do run some troll candidates at times. I think basing it more on like trying to build mutual aid institutions and trying to build build trade unions and things like that, or help with trade unions, I think is a better way to go about it. And that kind of also goes back into like my belief in like the Luxemburgist kind of idea of a dialectical relationship between a vanguard that is just the most advanced revolutionary, the most advanced revolutionary aspect of the working class, versus the spontaneity of the workers' movement. Like they both need each other, and you can't control the spontaneity or force it, but you also need some kind of institutions and leadership for spontaneous movements to plug into and to continue to grow so they don't just dissipate.
Right. I mean, it's a question of making sure that it is a proletarian party, but I think one of the bigger questions here is how to relate to Western party democracy in the kind of anti-political era where it's pretty much falling apart, and mass participation is at an all-time low in a way where people are kind of actively rejecting their so-called representation. And I think that I agree with you about troll candidates. A lot of the anti-politics people want Samuel L. Jackson to run for president. And, you know, there's a Samuel L. Jackson for president account on Twitter that I think is worth looking at for examples of a troll candidate for fucking with the bourgeois state from a progressive perspective.
I like the sound of that. Have you heard those Samuel L. Jackson reading kid stories?
Well, let's hear from Dan. But yeah,
Yeah,
that shit's great.
I think something salient that a couple of people, and you, Grant, specifically went into earlier for this conversation is looking not just at like the internal functioning of the party itself, but also the social context that exists in. And specifically with this, whereas looking at the SPD, something that McNair doesn't really go into is how they had this dense network of affiliated organizations and institutions that people would interact with the SPD through, whether they're like co-ops or trade unions or educational institutions, that let the SPD cast this like larger shadow on the class than you'd see just from its membership. And I think that's something definitely to look for when trying to apply their this Kautsky revolutionary strategy for today.
Yeah, and I just wanted to elaborate too. Like I'm insistent on this idea of like a party of activists, both because of what Grant was touching on with like this anti-political era that we've entered, but also with in regards to how difficult it is to have, you know, a more traditional party, especially in the United States. It's also, as I said, still difficult in Europe, but our government does not make it easy at all. So I think doing that kind of, you know, education program, co-ops, unions, mutual aid networks, all those kind of things are a better bet to have institutions, not to build a base per se, but to have institutions for a base to be involved with and to continue to grow once it spontaneously arises. I don't agree with everything that anti-politics argues for, but I think the idea that you know, we need politicians on the left who like don't give a fuck about, you know, the respectability of bourgeois government and to just speak their mind, I think that's actually it's a very good point, and I think we do need that. I kind of like that. I can't remember her name, but the indigenous woman who said, "Let's impeach the fucker." Like, as much as I'm skeptical of you know, the new democratic socialism that's trying to infiltrate the Democratic Party, I think that was kind of that was cool to me, and I think that's a sign that kind of space is opening up for more class independent people to go in and be like, yeah, not only fuck Trump, let's not only impeach that fucker, but let's impeach all of you because y'all suck. You know what I mean?
Right. Like that level of antagonism, but towards the whole regime, Trump, the Democrats, everything. And when I imagine Samuel L. Jackson running for president, I imagine in the same way that my friend Joe uses the term face hugger, the way Donald Trump just attached himself to the top of the Republican Party like an alien and just took over in this weird antagonistic way. I would love to see, as political breakdown continues, somebody to mess up the Democratic Party in a kind of similar way, but with more progressive aims than Donald Trump. And again, Samuel L. Jackson is a funny example of somebody who would be fucking hilarious to do that, and I hope he does. But and it
right.
kind of depends on your ability even to defy the left in certain ways, whether you would be able to do that. And so I think that opens up a whole different discussion. But
I guess there's one last thing from that section on Marxism as a political platform that I wanted to say here is a Marxist party then consists in principle of nothing more than a party which is committed to the ideas that the working class can only emancipate itself and humanity through struggling for communism, and that the struggle for communism can only be victorious through the action of the working class. So that's his minimal definition of a Marxist party. Now, Tom, there's two sections on the state and nation for some reason, And if you scroll down, there's a section on party. We've been talking a lot about party. Where do you think we should go? Thoughts?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, sorry. Do you want to go down to the party, or do you want to? Well,
I was
yeah.
thinking maybe we could touch on
Go
the
party.
stuff on party on 32. Yeah, it's just, we happen to be talking about it quite a bit, and it's very important.
Yeah.
So why the hell not? Yeah, let's see.
Will I take this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Party. This is a quote from the start. I've underlined in my book, so it's obviously very important. The idea that the working class need to unite and organize for political action at the level of the state, addressing the society as a whole, was inherited by Marx and Engels from Chartism. It was opposed by the Proudhonist. I have pronounced that right? Proudhonists.
Yeah, Proudhonists.
The irony of me not knowing a French pronunciation.
And getting corrected by me. Double irony.
Double irony. Two irony for me. Who advocated simply building a cooperative movement. It was opposed by the Bakuinists in the name of revolutionary spontaneity, direct action, and the revolutionary strike. So, like, to me, I think the idea of the party just really makes sense to operate. You should be, like, the thing is with the left, a lot of different, it seems to me, different elements of the left have this kind of, I don't know, fetishization of one form of organizing over another. It would seem to me that if we were ever going to be successful, you need to organize at every level of society. And so the party is just one of those elements that would need to be done, much like all the other elements need to be done at the same time. What do people think?
I
wanted to, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, like, my view of this is, I generally actually agree, but I think why I argue for maybe like a soft anti-political version, or like forming more of a party of activists, especially in the United States, is simply because we aren't in the same conditions that Marx and Engels were in at that time. And so I think in the US, to me, it seems very difficult to enter the state and to address the issue of capitalism within the state, because getting support from the masses in order to do this is one, difficult because of this kind of populist anti-political period that we are in. But well, I mean, I guess that's the main thing, but I think American government makes that incredibly difficult. But I am skeptical of like a hardline like anarchist or like more like left leaning abstentionism, or
right.
You know what I mean? I think like
I hate abstentionism too. I mean, don't get me wrong.
But let's take a look at this again, and I think that McNair is correctly Marxian about something, in that there is a difference between what the Marxists and what Marx is arguing in general. Most of the time, what most people consider to be Marxism in a political sense, versus the idea that all the organizations that we'll need will pop up in the course of struggle. That is more of a Bakuninist idea, and that's not to discredit it, but McNair will make this kind of clear. Like, it's not that we can't have anything that pops up during the struggle. That would be absurd. That would be a manager's ideology. But Marx is kind of pointing to something that people can do in, the movement's off time, in a way.
Yeah, and I think I agree ultimately with that. And I think that's more or less what I'm getting at by like more lefty politicos, or, a vanguard in the Luxemburgist sense, not in the Leninist sense of us forming a party or even like a pre-party political formation, is this idea of building an institution that people, that workers can plug into as things start to pop off. I think the Bakuninists went too far. And I think you also kind of see that going too far with the Spanish anarchists as well, where they have the opportunity to take power and they're like, nah, we'll just do our own thing. Like, to me, that doesn't make any sense at all. And I think it's fine. Like, besides just simply being a troll, like being oppositional to the bourgeois government as a candidate, a socialist candidate and politician even, I think you can advocate for things that will make it easier for workers to organize. And I think that is in fact what a minimum program is for, is to have these like tangible, concrete things that can make a dictatorship of the proletariat.
So one of the things that I just want to double back on is that I think McNair, in the way that a lot of Marxists treat early Marx as juvenilia, totally butchers what Marx means by the word political. And he goes and says the idea that the working class needed to unite and organize for political action at the level of state addressing society as a whole was inherited by Marx and Engels from Chartism. But Marx so at length criticizes this idea that a purely political, that the will, that just trying to use the state without social and economic foundations can affect a social revolution. He says in the critical notes on the King of Prussia, quote, "A social revolution possesses a total point of view because even if it is confined to only one factory district, it presents a protest by man against a dehumanized life because it proceeds from a point of view of the particular real individual, because the community against whose separation from himself the individual reacting is the true community of man, human nature. In contrast, the political soul of revolution consists in the tendency of the classes with no political power to put an end to their isolation from the state and from power. Its point of view is that of the state, of an abstract totality which exists only through its separation from real life and which is unthinkable in the absence of an organized antithesis between the universal idea and the individual existence of man." Basically, no matter how here's a great way of putting it. However limited an industrial revolt may be, it contains within itself a universal soul, and however universal a political revolt may be, its colossal form conceals a narrow split. And I know this kind of sounds abstract, but I think that if you look at the way these McNairist projects turn into sects jockeying for state power and are so overwhelmingly concerned with the internals of the left, and that happens for this kind of Draperist sect too with Marxist center, in my opinion. This myopic view of politics as everything and politics first before the proletariat and before the social, I think it's very harmful, and I think that it's throughout McNair's work, really.
Yeah,
Well,
I'd like to say something there. Is it true that of all the revolutions, most of them had little social revolutionary element?
Well, where
Maybe
revolutions
Spain.
are successful is based on their social acceptance, and Marx's critique of Robespierre in the text I just quoted, Critical Notes on King of Prussia, is that uses political will to try and change the world without social and economic foundations, and that he talks about the limits of a political revolution in reference to the French Revolution, and why the French Revolution fell apart in a lot of ways and was taken back over.
Like, if we were to look at,
that's why, like, to me, I don't read this as like purely political, ignoring the social. I think perhaps maybe McNair does ignore the social too much, but the way I read this is that where it says action at the level of the state addressing the society as a whole, the way I think of that is that you need both political and social. And I do see political as going downstream from the social. And so I do think that sometimes Marxists do get too stuck in the political, but I think it's a mistake to completely abandon the political. I think a lot of times Marxists put the cart before the horse and try to do political after do the political after. I'm sorry, I need to get this chat going away. You're all making me laugh. But I think sometimes like Marxists do put the political before the social, and that causes a lot of problems. But I also think that like dropping the political entirely is a mistake, and even if it's not in this anti-abstentionist way, it does lean itself more towards a left communist or more of an anarchist line, in my opinion.
Yeah. So one thing I was, oh God, after all that, I can't remember what the fuck I was going to say. Yeah, like, so as a critique of this book, I think that it's heavily missing an element on the social element, because if we think about what we're really looking for, we're looking for a social revolution, really, because if you have a social revolution,
Right.
the political revolution will probably be a function of the social revolution. This book seems to be largely a thing about how do you organize the political element, and it doesn't focus on the development of the social revolution. So I think we need to be quite clear with what this book is, and I think that's a big critique of it. But in fairness to it, I don't think he's trying to do everything. He's just trying to do that. What is, what should the political strategy be as opposed to the social strategy?
Yeah, and in fact, after the passage I quoted, Marx says the guy he's critiquing, the Prussian. So when I say Prussian, talking about the guy he's critiquing, brings his essay to a close worthy of it with the following sentence: "A social revolution without a political soul, i.e., without a central insight organizing it from the point of view of the totality, is impossible." And so then Marx analyzes that, and he says that, okay, so that's either nonsense or that makes sense, but it's like a paraphrase. He says, "A social revolution with a political soul is either a complete piece of nonsense, if by social revolution the Prussian understands that a social revolution as opposed to a political revolution, while at the same time he endows the social revolution with a political rather than a social soul. Or else a social revolution with a political soul is nothing but a paraphrase of what is usually called a political revolution or a revolution pure and simple. Every revolution dissolves the old order of society. To that extent, it is social. Every revolution brings down the old ruling power. To that extent, it is political. The Prussian must choose between this paraphrase and nonsense. But whether the idea of a social revolution with a political soul is paraphrase or nonsense, there is no doubt about the rationality of a political revolution with a social soul. All revolution, the overthrow of the existing ruling power and the dissolution of the old order, is a political act. But without revolution, socialism cannot be made possible. It stands in the need of this political act, just as it stands in the need of destruction and dissolution. But as soon as its organizing functions begin and its goal, its soul emerges, socialism throws its political mask aside." I think that gets into Marx's kind of like crazy ambivalence about the word political. And I know that I can seem pedantic when I jump into it, but I think it can really inform us in our time when like the 20th century was a disaster when it comes to our relationship to the state.
Yeah, it's difficult to strike the right balance here because, yes, McNair is following a lot of Marxists in kind of, and Marx himself, it has to be said, like Marx stops talking about, the social versus the political in the way that he did when he was younger. And he starts thinking things more, as a matter of fact, he stops talking like that because he stops talking like a Hegelian. I can't cut that shit out. So he stops talking like a Hegelian as he gets older. And he starts talking more in terms of bourgeois politics, proletarian politics. So it's maybe good to like stop back into the earlier Marx, but also honestly, like the liberal views of revolution. That like if you listen to Mike Duncan's Fabulous Revolutions podcast, he makes a similar distinction between political and social revolution. And very consistently, you had enlightened liberals that wanted political revolution but not social revolution, and the socialists that took the social quite seriously, right? And there's a whole element of this that has sort of been lost to history, where socialists were necessarily concerned with social revolution. And that's not to say that what McNair has to say about the party, or even what Marx thinks about politics more generally, doesn't hold, because as you admit, Grant, this is a weird double sort of dance that Marx is doing, and he wants to put aside the political mask, but nonetheless there is that political mask. And to the extent that this is the form but not the content, we are concerned with forms. We're not beyond them. We're not yet transcendent.
Right, but if those forms negate the very content we're seeking to achieve, we have to be aware of that. And I think that
no one's unaware of that.
Yeah, No, I know that you are. I know that you are. But I think that McNair might be missing things that you aren't. And
sure,
I think that McNair has a whole essay about how the early Marx is basically juvenilia. And I think that by doing so, and frankly, I would argue somebody like Gary Teeple makes the great argument connecting the early Marx to the works on political economy. And I would say, too, that it's very clear the ambivalence when he's arguing against the abstentionists, and he has to use the word politics. There's clear ambivalence there in the 1870s. The work I quoted, that's the 1840s. In the 1870s, Marx has this ambivalence when he's even defending the political form. And he, in the writings on the Paris Commune, is talking about society reabsorbing the state's functions away from politics. So I do not think you can dismiss this as the early Marx or juvenilia to talk about the social and political antagonism. And I don't think you are, but I think that McNair does.
Okay.
I mean, I think I don't like the kind of, and I don't know as much about McNair as y'all do, but if he's doing this like dividing Marx between young and old Marx, that seems kind of like an Althusserian trope that I disagree with ultimately. Like, I think we need to see it as just a growth in understanding, and that doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but it means that we need to look at the work as a totality and see how it applies to our current conditions. And I think the obvious answer to me is that we need both the political and the social. And I think ultimately we all agree on that. Whether or not McNair agrees with that, I'm not entirely sure, but from what you all have described, it seems like he is missing something here. And perhaps with this pamphlet in particular, he is intentionally focusing on the political, and that is an important thing to tackle. But I think if we are, I don't know. I kind of lost my train of thought.
It just seemed, I agree with you, that it seems glaring in a critique. Like, it's not that it's wrong to talk about politics, it's that it's glaring in a critique of the 20th century that he's making, that he's still so caught up in this high level where, like, people I know who follow McNair, it feels like they're more concerned about, well, what if Bukharin allied with Trotsky like this and this and this? And sure, we could have had a better Soviet Union, but we live today, one, and two, we can't strategize presupposing that, like, far and away politics where the proles aren't involved is like the way we're going to be doing things. And I feel like McNair's thinking is kind of trapped in that in certain ways.
Well, and I guess it's kind of,
or at least his acolytes. I mean, McNair has good qualities, but at least some of his acolytes.
For sure. But I think this, I kind of remember where I wanted to go before. Like, I do think that the politics is important, and like a centralized organ and a political organ is important because we are trying to build a dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think that if we are building a dictatorship of the proletariat, we do have this focus on political, and it is a really difficult dance we have to do to where we don't abandon the social and we try to make it so that that workers are involved in the political. And I think that's where addressing the social first and then the political becomes important, if that makes sense.
Right. And it's a question of whether it's there's this kind of dialectical dance where it's like you're expanding the political or you're dissolving the divide between it and civil market society, between the political and everyday life, in a way that transcends both for Marx. And it's really, you can't just say do away with all political action. I completely agree, but it is so contextualized in Marx what political action is and should mean, and what and that it's the proletariat using a political party, not about the victory of the left.
So I'm thinking maybe we should move on to the next paragraph here, which sort of starts to get at the class in itself, or and I'm sorry, the class, for itself. I don't know if I should read this whole thing. It is an important point. I'm just gonna bite it off here. All right. The definition of the proletariat by its separation from the means of production, as opposed to peasants and artisans, means that the proletariat as a class includes the whole class, employed and unemployed, men, women, children, which is dependent on the wage fund. This in turn means that though trade unions are one of the most important forms of worker organization, it is only party organization based in the working class districts, and tackling all aspects of the experience of the class, which is really capable of expressing the unity of the class as a class, its independent interests, its existence as a class for itself. It is party organization which can embed the particular trade union struggles in the solidarity of the broader masses and legitimate them against the attempts of the bosses to isolate them and present them as sectional claims. So this is, again, even in the United Kingdom, even at this difficult point in trade union history, the United Kingdom, if I'm not mistaken, is about at a 25% unionization rate. So this is still in the context of thinking about how to wield party power in a way to increase the working class's position in the trade union struggle, which even if you are in the United Kingdom, there are a lot of people that have a sort of nausea about the labor movement, right? But of course, in the United States, this seems necessary, but from a completely different direction. We barely. It feels at least like we barely have these sorts of the sorts of legitimacy for labor at all, and other than in these pockets where there are still sort of guilds.
Yeah, I think this next paragraph actually to me, it seems to kind of soothe at least a little bit of the concerns that Grant raised, because there is this talk about why a party is important, and it's important because it better addresses the class for itself rather than just pure trade unions. And I don't think Grant is like a trade unionist or anything like that, but I think this, I think this definitely articulates the need, like why a party might be better suited to represent the class as a whole. And I think in the United States, that does, to me, point towards the need of a party, perhaps even first, before we can have the more spontaneous, trade unions and more spontaneous movements and things like that, because there's nowhere for those movements to go. Ultimately, they just kind of do the thing for a little while and then they sputter out. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot. Sorry, but
it's okay. Let's see. Do we have anything else to say about these? Because we can move on to the. Let's see.
I like this. I like this little section here I've underlined.
Yeah.
Okay, this is about the Euro communists, who was basically the shift from the communist parties into the kind of, they went to the right essentially in Europe Tony Blair and Jack Straw and a lot of these were Euro-communists. The Euro-communists removed the party key to the trade union and Labour broad left and supported their Labour... Sorry, the Euro-communists... Okay, so this is talking about how the Euro-communists destroyed the CPGB once Stalin went down. Or, sorry, once the Soviet Union went down. I think I'm broadly correct with that.
It's complicated. I think the CPGB collapsed around the same time as the Soviet Union, so we would be talking about like the 70s, I think.
Yeah. So the Euro-communists removed the party key to the trade union and Labour broad left and supported their Labour co-thinkers, the Blairite soft left. As a result, the broad mass sentiment of solidarity had no political channels to flow into generalized active resistance to the government. A movement without a political party is not enough. So we're getting this... Go on, Grant.
Sorry, you just look at Podemos and every pretty much 21st century example of when at Syriza, when the left kind of channels movements into these political sphere things, it seems, and into their own leadership as the left, it seems that these things stop becoming developments in proletarian self-confidence and learning the limits of spontaneous organization as well, and become jockeying for state power.
Right, but you could still make that critique without dismissing. You could still make that critique without dismissing this, because a movement without a political party may not be enough, but also if you build like that kind of political subjectivity, you're fucked.
Is it also not, Grant, though, that those emergent things like 15M or whatever, that they have a shelf life, and it's natural that once they go that a party will take them up? But what that indicates is that...
Right, even now, Macron is putting forward some idiotic candidate who's probably going to wear a yellow vest for the European Union elections. I've heard something like that. I mean, it's once social support is withdrawn from these things, where it starts to sputter out, I think you see them get taken advantage of. But I also think Syriza is a good example of when this actively diffused social antagonisms.
Well, and
Podemos is a better example. I'm sorry. Podemos is a better example because unlike this, frumpy left unity effort like Syriza, Podemos, they were a party born of struggle. Now, and we remember...
That's not how I think about Podemos at all, but go on.
But listen, the Indignados, they screened out all of the politicos.
Right, the Indignados. I feel like I separate Podemos and 15.
I know you do, but just like Lenin and Stalin, one leads to the other, baby. And what you got from the Indignados was basically an emergent political form that had most of the problems of some kind of, hawk together left unity effort that is repurposed for a social movement. So
Lexi, I agree with you that we should make the anti-political critique of these emergent moments in the proletariat, but aren't you saying that that's exactly the way it bends?
This is the way it bends, no matter what the origin of the party is from. You still have to make the critique, even if it doesn't come up during the beauty of the struggle or something.
I'm not a beauty. I don't ever. When have I talked about the beauty of the struggle? I mean, I think
you know what I mean. But this is a difference. This is a difference in the way people think about organization. Is that organizations that existed beforehand and want to be, part of a movement that comes up, that's ridiculous. We have to look only to the organizations that are built during the course of a spontaneous sort of movement. And in reality, both types of organization run into the same problems, is my point.
I think the important thing is to look at social base. Go on, sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, so like for me, ultimately, I think what we're doing here, whether we like to admit it or not, is that we are all lefty politicos. Even those of us who are, have more of an anti-political bent, even those of us who are proletariat in that we are dependent on the wage fund or for labor aristocratic or for petite bourgeois, regardless of all that, we aren't capable of making a spontaneous movement happen, right? So like I think we have to be mindful of that. And I think, honestly, the solution to this awkward dance that we have to do is that I think instead of going immediately and forming a party, we have to build pre-party organizations that can eventually lead to a party once there is that kind of natural need for it, if that makes any sense. And so I think ultimately what I'm trying to say is I think we agree more than we disagree. And I think some people just put more emphasis on one versus the other. But ultimately, a movement without a political party is not enough. But a political party without a movement is also not enough. And I think we see that with Syriza in particular.
Yeah, what we're trying to say is it's dialectical, and I'm only joking. But the problem is that to give out about, say, Podemos with respect to the 15M movement is to miss the point that the 15M movement is not really a social movement. It's it's a premature ejaculation. It's that's what it is, because it hasn't got a body. God. It's literally just sitting in a square for a few days. It's got no long-term life. It's got nothing. The social movement, it's like a cry for a social movement. The fact that it goes political afterwards is a function of the fact that it's not really a developed full-ass social movement. And we'll see this happen again and again and again. So what we, as Marxists, we should be thinking about, well, we need to build the social movement and the political movement. But one without the other is not enough. And a shitty premature ejaculant like Occupy or 15M or you name it, and will have the same problems. And I think Grant is right in saying that Syriza nearly took the steam out of what was happening maybe in Greece in their crisis. But I think that if actually the social thing was so strong in Greece, it wouldn't have strangled it. So
I think Podemos is the premature ejaculation of 15M in a certain sense. I think that it's wrong to underestimate, the things that have actually mobilized people in the 21st century, on a mass scale. Even if
I'm not saying
if they have limits, we can critique.
Yes, I just think that. So what I'm trying to say is that,
I guess I'm not about building a political movement in a certain sense. I don't know. I mean, I'm coming from a stage where.
Are you committed to total disempowerment? I can't imagine you are, and you have to acknowledge that these flashes in the pan go, tied in, tied out every 5 years for the last 3-4 decades.
I mean, I know we can say we're all leftist politicos or whatever, but it's starting to feel my involvement with the left it just seems like another stripe of reaction when I get involved in any of the actual projects, other than intellectually discussing these things.
I know, but even when you're discussing it, it's like you are afraid of your commitments, and you are afraid that
something good that existed right now would probably have to deal with my political attachments too, in a antagonistic way, and that's what I'm trying to get at is that the left is not necessarily the fundamental origin point of emancipatory movement in the 21st century for me. I don't know.
That's all.
I think the thing is that it's definitely not at the moment. And we're dealing with our situation. Where are we? How weak are we? Whatever. We're fucking dead in the water at the moment. And any of these things will fall apart. They might go into a political formation which will slowly not deliver what we want. But we should realize where we are in this. This idea that the revolution is going to happen tomorrow or in the next 5 years is nonsense. And we should be thinking long term. And this book is a long term one, even though it's not a complete totality that we will all agree with. But I think we move on a little bit, because we don't have to. It's not I think we kind of agree with a lot of anti-political stuff. When it's not this whole book is about anti-politics.
No, very little of it is.
I'm not trying to make anti-politics dominate the conversation. It just seems to rear its head.
Grant, I agree. I mean, I don't want it to make it we're talking against you, because I think I'm talking with you. But I mean, like, I don't know. I just because I think I broadly agree with it. That's what I don't know. I'm not being clear. Okay, ignore me. I'll mute.
It's hard to be clear about these things, honestly. It is, and this book does not make the anti-political critique. I think that's something that American, neo-Kautskyis, or the more critical European neo-Kautskyis, like Tom or whatever we're going to call ourselves. I have no fucking clue. It doesn't matter. That's something we're going to be bringing to the book, and it just should be noted that that's not going to be in here. And if you come here looking for endnotes, you're going to be disappointed. But anyway,
anti-politics is not endnotes for sure. Yeah, but fight me.
All right. The last paragraph of this section, and then I think maybe we should either double back to class or to the state and nation parts.
I think state and nation we should do. Yeah,
because there's two state and nation categories, which I thought was a little weird. There's one at the beginning, the state and nation, and then there's one state and nation down here. But anyway, this is just something. This is something that I guess that I was saying before, is that so a movement without political parties will prove rapidly to be illusory. This, of course, leaves on one side the question, what sort of party in this sense? This was already debated between Marx and Engels and their co-thinkers on the one hand, and on the Lassalleans and Bakuninists on the other. But systematic argument and the disastrous errors of Stalinism and Trotskyism on the question belong to the strategies of the 20th century. So the idea of the systematic view of a party is, again, a Leninist invention, more or less. And
what does he mean? What does he mean by that?
Well, it's parallel to what I was saying before, that these questions of party, these more detailed discussions, are something that we're bringing to the table afterwards. The question that Marx and Engels was arguing versus Lassalle and versus Bakunin was more of just the most general concept here. The most general concept of, yes, we need to do a sort of oppositional party politics. We can't really like throw in with the, Juncker, like aristocratic kind of state in the way that Lassalle might do. But we also can't just oppose all form of, like organization or, electoral activity like a Bakuninist would do. That's what's being said there. And that the systematic stuff beyond that is an elaboration of the 20th century with reaction to Leninism, which I think is a bit reductive. But anyway, should we double back then?
Double back to where?
You just when you think we're getting somewhere, we're going right back to the start. Just
we wouldn't want to finish chapter 1.
No. Well, I think it'll be one of the heady ones. We talk here about this bit here. Is it the critique of the Gotha program?
Yeah. Let's start on the state and the nation.
Well, we don't need to read too much of it, but we can just talk about the general idea. I think he's going to talk about essentially how, we should stand separate from the nation. And that was from the state. And that was one of Marx's big critiques in the Gotha program, was that it basically led to a dependence on the state. Well, I read this paragraph here. Both Marx and Engels, in criticizing the Gotha program. Well, let's just tell people what the Gotha program was first. The Gotha program was a program put together by the Lassalleans. Am I correct?
I think so.
In the SPD. Was it SPD or was it the precursor?
I think it's the SPD, but I'm going to go look that up.
Okay.
Actually, I think it was the precursor.
Yeah, I think it was a precursor too. But anyway, it was like a left German socialist party, and they came up with a program that would basically come up with what we would kind of call, I suppose, today, social democrat type of reforms, maybe job guarantees and things like that. I can't remember exactly what they were, but Marx and Engels criticized it. And they did so. They insisted the compromises of expression for the sake of avoiding prosecution are perfectly acceptable. Okay, so like saying things like, you know, we're not going to put in our program, we're not going to say we want to, you know, kill the bourgeoisie or the, you know, the king or something. That's fair enough because you don't want to get arrested yourself. The fundamental problem they see in the draft in this respect is that it miseducates the workers by promoting dependence on the state. Okay. And then the second was that the proletarian class is an international class and the proletarian movement is necessarily an international movement. Okay. So, like, what do people think about that? I think those critiques are, well, it's hard. It's hard to think about the Gotha program like a left thing that wouldn't have dependence on the state today. That's nearly impossible to think of.
Well, the left and the state got married in the 20th century in such a fundamental way, like through social democracy and things of that nature.
Just for the record, the Gotha program is the founding congress of the SPD. They merged in 1875.
Right. I was saying why Tom and I would be thinking it's hard to imagine today. I didn't mean to say this is.
Oh, no. I wasn't responding to you. Just as a footnote to what we were saying earlier, it's the founding congress of the SPD, the Gotha Congress.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of talking about this before we went on air too, of like how, like with a minimum program, you know, if I remember correctly, the critique of the Gotha program was specifically said that the introduction to it that I read, I think, was like basically made the point that the minimum program that they're outlining here is supposed to be amenable with the existence of capitalism. But what Marx and Engels are critiquing is that it's too dependent on like a bourgeois state for aid. But one of the things that we were talking about before we went live was like how difficult it would be, not simply because the left got married to the state in the 20th century, but also because of like, if we're talking about some kind of minimum program that allows capitalism to still exist, how are we going to have that exist in a way that isn't just fucking over the capital of the working class by removing any kind of welfare or anything that will help them, right? And with the existence of capitalism. And I think kind of what we agreed upon is that a minimum program is supposed to make it essentially inevitable that there's going to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, if not establish a dictatorship of the proletariat in and of itself. And I think Lexi said something to the effect that by necessity, a dictatorship of the proletariat is still going to be capitalism. And wasn't 100% sure exactly what she meant by that. But what go ahead.
I just mean that assuming that proletarians are taking power in a capitalist society, they're not going to be able to transform the economy overnight.
Right. Okay. So I guess, and kind of the thing I was bringing up is that like what you want as part of your minimum program is not simply dependence on the state, but also education programs that make it possible so that the proletariat can help govern and also expand the political realm to include more people. And I kind of referenced the issues of the specialized division of labor that was talked about during the Swampside Chats episode on state and revolution, and how essentially that you had in the Soviet Union, it was difficult to, early Soviet Union specifically, it was difficult to institute this notion that every cook can govern because you had specialists who were resistant to the implementation of socialism or the implementation of a dictatorship of the proletariat. And so what I agreed for is that even more than just simply allowing everybody to have access to a college education, expanding trade union, or not trade union, expanding like trade education programs and expanding education in general to teach proletariats how to run a bureaucracy and how to make sure the power plants are still going and all these sorts of things, so that it becomes possible to continue to run society under a dictatorship of the proletariat without needing to rely on these specialists who are still loyal to capitalism, but B, make it so that any could govern, so where even if they're not working in these specialized fields, they have enough baseline knowledge of how to run a society that they could enter into government. And it isn't just this like a specialized political class that develops, if that makes any sense.
Right. There's this need to take on the division of labor actively and to take the measures Marx talks about in the Paris Commune to make participation not just this abstract thing or a career, but like real participation and real democracy, frankly.
All right, so let's see. We have Tom's. Let's see what we got. Tom. Let's see what Tom highlighted here. Oh, so I guess we're over here on the state and nation section. I hope you don't mind a bit of a bounce back to the text here. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is all like part and parcel to the anti-political thing, is the dependence on the state. It's actually sort of, again, this is something more advocated by the Lassalleans, and I think is sort of probably best thought of as the legacy of Bismarck, like that what Bismarck really wanted to do was make the working class feel like the state was their friend. And to institute these welfare programs so that, instead of some kind of scary revolutionary force that was independent of the state, that the state would be the major check on the market, and that the working class would look to the state instead of to their own, powers to challenge the forces of the bourgeoisie. And mission accomplished, Otto. Way to go. So with... Yeah, look, in retrospect, we probably shouldn't do that.
Well, I think... Oh, sorry.
No, that's it.
What about modern Munchie theory? Surely we should mar that into the Communist Manifesto.
Boo!
Okay, sure, that's something everyone can agree on.
I was just going to say, I think what I was trying to say earlier, too, is that, like, if you're going to have a dictatorship proletariat, you actually do still need welfare, but you also need to expand the political and try to overcome these divisions of labor, as Grant was talking about. I guess that's ultimately what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, you can even look at, I have critiques of the document, but you look at Kollontai like trying to figure out, all right, the Soviet Union is such a mess right now. What do we do in the left opposition documents? And one of the things she talks about is just workers are trying to, implement their own communal kitchens and things of that nature, not these kind of state-run bureaucratic welfare things. They're just going to the state to get these resources, and they're running into all this red tape, and they just want to do it themselves. But in a society where we just view the political will as everything, it's going to, the state just sees every deficiency as something wrong with its own administration, not with the deference of all activity in the public sphere to the state to begin with.
Listen, don't ever talk bad about my bay ever again.
I love Kollontai. This is my point.
I'm teasing. We should move on, though.
Wait, did we ever actually read the principles in this section that that McNair says are found in Marx and Engels' writings, but are not in the French Workers' Party program? Did we ever just state what they were?
My internet went down, so...
We did. The 1 and 2, the individual form and the collective form from there.
No, it's the first concerns a question. The state, the workers' movement must not propose dependence on the existing or the free state.
Okay, yeah, let's read them here.
All right. So that's going to be the second paragraph and the third paragraph.
No, we did. Yeah,
all right.
I read the second half of that, and I read the next part of this. Yeah.
Okay,
that.
so,
Yeah.
so we are all right. So we already got, don't depend on the existing state or some kind of free state, and the working class, the proletarian class, is an international class. Has to be an international movement. Flows logically from the character of capitalism. All right, so we did talk about that. Okay, then moving on. Let's talk more about class. So
Was there any section? Sorry, was there any sections in this classing that people thought we should? Because it goes on for. I have a good bit underlined because it's quite a long. It's 3 pages.
Yeah, there's it starts off with a classic political question that if you go on Twitter, you're going to encounter quite a bit of. And it's the question of, the idea that the emancipation of the working class can only be achieved through the struggle for communism, and that's false, and that the emancipation of the working class is only part of the struggle for human liberation. And this is what he quotes. Okay. Relations of oppression or exploitation arising from patriarchy, humanity's predatory contact towards the rest of the biosphere, racism, the denial of political and individual freedom, choice of sexual orientation, or minority cultures are equally important and cannot be, quote, mechanically transferred back to the resolution of the central economic conflict. And perhaps, quote, growing complexity and fragmentation of societies leads inter alia, among other things, to, quote, a weakening of the feeling of belonging of the working class and spatial deconstruction of labor, which makes more fragile the forms of organization of the traditional movement and encourages a decline in unionization. Quote. Okay, so we have 2 separate claims here. First of all, the macro structures of class don't, if you solve these problems, you're not going to sort of mechanically work everything else out. So class emancipation isn't really true human emancipation. The second being that the labor movement in its traditional forms is basically obsolete, more or less. These two are taken up in particular by endnotes. I think they're probably articulated best in the Marxist sense, probably in that sort of strand of communization, particularly in notes 3, where they really double down on that first part. So I think that's the challenge of being a Marxist in the contemporary left. And what does McNair say to this?
He says, wrong.
Yes, he says wrong. They're very widespread. These are very widespread views on the left, but they're mistaken. It's possible to respond to them by pointing out that working class self-identification is as much a subjective as an objective reality. Let's see.
Do you want me to read this bit? I have a few bits underlined.
Yeah,
take this. Okay. It can be added that the growing fragmentation of labor has not shown any tendency to recreate genuine petty family production. On the contrary, this continues to retreat globally. What it has created is widespread employment in relatively small workplaces. These were the conditions of the 19th century workforce, under which Chartism and the early trade union movement, the First International and the early socialist parties were created. The implication then is not goodbye to the working class, but rather that the means of struggle need to change. They need to shift from work-based collective organization to district collective organization. It is also that trade unions need to become again, as Marx called them, an alliance of the employed and the unemployed, and one which performs significant welfare and education functions rather than simply being an instrument of collective bargaining on wages and conditions.
Yeah, and I think that falls in line with like a modern analysis of like of what's generally called like Marxist feminism, where you look at like reproductive labor as well as like productive labor, and also look at just kind of like an answer to like the kind of almost a centralizing of national cultures and marginalized cultures and things like that. and it's not to say that these cultures need to be collapsed and ignored in the way that people who are workerist or class reductionists do, but rather that we acknowledge that that this diversity exists, and that these kind of marginalization mechanisms under capitalism that keep, Black and brown people out of the labor market in ways that it doesn't do to white workers, puts them in that class position, and that this needs to be addressed by socialists. It's a very similar issue with trans people today as well.
Yeah, more generally, he says then he goes on to say on page 30, at a more fundamental level of theory, the authors of the program of the Parti ouvrier could neither have claimed that the emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex or race, nor that the working class needs a distinct political party if they had believed that the working class is what Euro-communists and other theorists of beyond the working class have argued. It is not the employed worker strength at the point of production which animated Marx and Engels' belief that the key to communism is the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat and vice versa. On the contrary, it is the proletariat's separation from the means of production, the impossibility of restoring small-scale family production, and the proletariat's consequent need for collective voluntary organization, which led them suppose that the proletariat is a potential universal class, that its struggles are capable of leading to socialism and to a truly human society. So in this way of looking at the proletariat, I don't want to just say, oh, all these debates are, not really debates, and we don't have to talk. That's the opposite of what I'm trying to say. What I want to say is that, like, there is a way of making worker into something more exclusive that causes problems with identity politics, quote unquote. But that form of workerism is really itself its own form of identity politics. And what we're really talking about is a structural position, and that's it's vital.
I think McNair is right to emphasize that people totally miss when they're critiquing Marx as class reductionist, that he locates in the proletariat something special in part because the emancipation of one section of the proletariat, in fact, the emancipation of all of society, is bound up in the emancipation of the proletariat in a unique way where the identities just don't relate to each other in that way on their own. Like outside of the proletarian relationship, it just doesn't all compute in a way that would advance universal goals. If you've got like the bourgeoisie's interests in mind, for example.
Yeah, one, I agree with that, but I also like really had this kind of interesting realization that this kind of ties everything we've been talking about together in a way, because if we have a political party that has that kind of social soul or whatever we were talking about earlier, it's focused on not just enforcing political will, but also, as McNair's been talking about, a political party is suited to suit the needs of working class districts, which would include people who are doing reproductive labor who wouldn't be represented by a trade union. And it also kind of speaks towards this notion of not depending on the bourgeois state, because if you have a political party that's connected to mutual aid societies and organizations, then you can kind of start to build dual power in that you have a party or working class organizations that are making sure people's needs are being taken care of. And that doesn't mean that we also say, oh no, fuck welfare or anything like that, but welfare doesn't go far enough often, so it's supplemented by these mutual aid organizations.
Yeah, That's
Yeah.
no. I mean, no. It's a really apt summary, and it points to the problem of when we don't have trade unions to help us build that kind of alternative, independent power base. Why people return to trade unions? You know, after going, you know, looking around and trying to figure out what else to do. We don't really have that much of a model, you know, for how to build independent working class power within capitalism. That isn't something like trade unions and isn't something like eventually a workers' party of some kind that has something to do with those unions, because it's an independent source of power, social power, not just political power.
Right, and I think that's why like pre-party formations in the current is a current like way to address these, and that in a way that purely trade unions cannot, because it only focuses on the productive side of things. Whereas, you know, you have unemployed and you have social reproductive labor that needs to be represented and needs to have like both a social power but also a political will and a means to express that.
Lexi, do you want to read those 2 paragraphs there? Is Lexi?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. All right. The negative judgment consists in the proposition that, however weak the workers' movement, general human emancipation on the basis of petty family property and production is impossible, and hence the idea of this or that section of the petty proprietors or the undifferentiated people serving as a revolutionary subject is illusory. This judgment was founded on the whole history of radical movements down to Marx and Engels' time. It has been emphatically confirmed in the 20th century by, precisely, the defeats suffered by the workers' movement through submerging itself in a worker-peasant alliance, national movement, or broad democratic alliance. The most serious of these defeats is Stalinism itself. Stalinism did not take and hold power in the name of the dictatorship of the proletariat over the other classes. It took it in the name of the worker-peasant alliance and held it in the name of a socialism in which the obvious existence of classes in the Stalinist states was denied. So
this is where McNair starts to, you know, go in on the 20th century. McNair is really one of the harshest critics of the 20th century I've ever heard, in fact.
That's what makes it hard to believe he's not some kind of autonomist, you know, is that he is pretty eyes open about it. But he's not an autonomist, and it sort of points a way forward.
Right. I don't think you have to be a anti-party to reject the 20th century as a model.
Yeah, I think so. And he also dismisses the women's movement here and the same-sex movement. You know, today it'd be the trans movement that's more pretty dominant. Like, and then he also gives out about green politics. I like this one.
Well, I think we should qualify how he dismisses them.
Because it's a very specific sense that he rejects the idea of a cross-class political actor forming from these movements.
Yes,
because he's not opposed actually to these movements in a sense, and it should be noted that he comes out of the gay movement. He wrote a book with James Gough, I think his name is, and it's called Gay Liberation in the 80s. It's an interesting Marxist feminist application of Marxist feminist theory to gay liberation. And so yeah, his background is actually in the gay movement. So he's not saying these things as an idle, you know, dismisser of identity movements.
Right. He says the quote women's movement quote, and I think the quote there is not dismissive of the idea of a women's movement, but is dismissive of the idea that this is a movement in like the mass sense. In the US and Britain, where it began, has since the latter 1970s been so divided by class, race, sexuality, and politics as to be no more than an ideological expression. And he says the same is true of the lesbian and gay movement here. Like, I think that's really, I don't know, look at the contemporary queer scenes on the left and that sort of thing. I think that you can see that there is a problem with political identity, with treating identity as political first, even, I think.
Right. Yeah, because I think what ends up happening, even if you have like a more radical feminist take on centering identity that's, you know, supposedly revolutionary, they completely drop class. And what ends up happening is that these identity-based movements get absorbed into capitalism. You kind of see this in some. There's unfortunately not enough literature on this, but from what I've read, there's kind of this idea of like the Dharma and Greg effect, right? So Dharma and Greg was this sitcom about two white, gay, petite bourgeois men in New York City that really kind of normalized the gay identity in the late 90s. And I remember being a kid growing up, and this is well before I knew I was trans or queer in any way. And I remember my parents watching this, and my dad, you know, my dad and my stepmom had gay friends that they were really close to. And this whole idea of what it meant to be gay shifted. But what the Marxist literature on this points out is that this leaves out a whole section of people who are not represented by this what's being put forward. You know, it doesn't represent queer black and brown people. It doesn't represent trans people. It doesn't represent working class cis gay people, you know. And this is a function of what this is to me, this is a function of like liberal democracy, you know, is that it promises you a seat at the table, but you just have to abandon certain sections of your movement in order to get a seat at the table. And in my experience, I've experienced more harassment as a trans person from cis gay people than I have cis straight people, because cis gay people feel like they should be able to get away with it. And you see a similar thing with cis white gay people being racist because, you know, they're quote unquote marginalized, so they should be able to say what they want, but that's obviously not true.
Yeah, so it's complicated, right? And we're not going to solve quote intersectionality quote right now, but the point is that he actually says something that is specifically related to ethnic minorities, but that I think is also kind of broadly true. One group of elders, imams, etc., are preferred interlocutors of the state. Another layer of the ethnic minorities has entered into the business and professional classes. Neither represents the youth, who periodically take to the streets. These individualized forms of identity politics, as he calls them, and I really think it's the individualized forms that we should be really stressing here. This has led to exactly the kind of divide and conquer stuff that I know it's like day one liberalism. We're not supposed to talk about how these things divide the working class. But I don't mean this in the way like, you know, Adam Proctor or Amber A. Lee Frost means it, or Adolph Reed means it. I mean that the racists and the sexists and, you know, the kind of structures of oppression make it difficult for oppressed people to approach the common working class project. And that's not to say develop a crippling neurotic anxiety about your privilege so you live 5 years shorter, and then will the working class movement take off. It's more complicated than that. Anyway.
Are we done on class, or do people want to talk?
You wanted to cover the stuff on greens, which I think is important, but a sort of like it's not quite the identity point. It's a related point, and it's a parallel development.
Yeah, like so, well, let me just read it here. Green politics, in its broadest sense, is yet another alternative favoured by advocates of the end of class politics. Yet it is even clearer that in the other social movements that Greens are forced to choose between one or another form of economic organisation. They are divided and unable to lead society as a whole because they are unable to choose collectively one way or the other. And when a distinctively green policy is produced, it offers precisely the reactionary utopia of a return to petty family production, or in extreme cases, the deep greens, the death of the vast majority of the world's present population in order to return to an idealized version of hunter-gatherer societies. It's interesting, like in the crisis, just before the crisis happened in Ireland, the Greens got into power for the first time as part of the junior party in a coalition, and they literally had to ditch everything, all the things that we're going to keep to the Kyoto Agreement and everything. And do you know what they ended up getting? What policy they got? It was like I think it was, you could get up to, on a £2,000 bicycle, you could get a tax-free allowance for that. So what happened is rich people bought really fancy fucking bikes at half price.
Oh my God.
That was the culmination.
This is where the Tories on bikes memes come from?
Probably, Dave Cameron and all these guys. But like, I just think it shows, like, if you think about it from just a systemic point of view, if you break up society into all these slightly different small sections, 5% Greens here, 10% queer people here, you got 5% Asian people in Britain here, and you break people up in their politics like that, you're putting 5 or 10% against 90%. It's never going to be able to do anything revolutionary. The only class that can be revolutionary is the biggest class, and it kind of makes sense, or a very fucking well-equipped, super rich class.
It's about like a sort of humanist revolution for all of humanity, right? Like it would have to be necessarily an act of the majority. It has to be, and again, it's really politically uncouth to bring up divide and conquer. But I mean, Divet et Imperia, like, it's an old strategy. There's a reason that it's around, and it works. It works like a charm, and it's suicidal to ignore.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right in that, like, the way divide and conquer works isn't the way that these workers mean it, but it's in that, like, that's the whole thing with white supremacy and how it's so integral in capitalism, especially American capitalism, because this was set up in mind with, giving white workers a leg up over black, specifically black, but also black and brown workers, so that they can, that they'll side with their bosses and their oppressors over having unity with people of different races. And the points at which the United States government was most insecure about the workers' movement was when there was this class race unity against their oppressors.
Shall we move on to the next section of State and Nation? Tom?
This second section of State and Nation really only makes the point that you have to organize internationally because capitalism does. I think that's literally the only point in it. Does anybody have anything to say about it?
Nope. That's we've pretty much already talked about the sort of autarky that results from the Soviet Union. There's like pushback on the globalization, like the anti-globalization theorists or something. Yeah, I think you're right. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, like, because we'll try and get this we're down to the last section. We're running live now for 2 hours, so I kind of want to be finished sometime this month. But
let's do it.
Yeah, the unity and strength is the big one. Who wants to take some of this one? Is Grant alive? He's dead.
Yeah, let's bring Grant in for one last swing.
You're asking me to take this one? What are we looking at here?
I don't know.
Unity is strength. Oh boy.
What's the general point of this? Lexi, you give us the general point. You kick us off or something.
Well, the general point of this was about what kind of unity to pursue. Let's see. I think the best summary of this is, let's see.
Is it this idea of unity at all costs versus unity of strength?
It's a qualification on, yes, of course we need unity. However, there's certain forms of unity that are fatal. And so let's read the happy part, right? The happy part here is or maybe we should, you know what, let's read the historical part first. It's in the beginning. Let's see. Okay. In 1875, the German socialists made a choice with which Marx and Engels disagreed, to unify their forces on the basis of a program which had a, quote, diplomatic character and obscured their differences. The fusion happened at just the right time. The process of German unification under Prussian leadership was accelerating, and the German economy had arrived at industrial takeoff. In consequence, the unified Social Democratic Party of Germany was immensely successful, growing in the later 19th and early 20th centuries to a vast and deeply rooted system of mass organizations. The result was that the principle of unity at all costs became generalized and incorporated into the strategy of the socialist movement. Unifications and attempt to unify divided forces were promoted in France, unity, and elsewhere. Supporters could point to the awful example of disunited and hence ineffective socialist movements elsewhere. Were the leaders of the Second International correct to incorporate the principle of unity at all costs into their strategy? The example is complex. The positive effects of broad unity, in substance a, quote, snowball effect, were demonstrated in the rise of the SPD and more broadly the Second International. They have been reconfirmed positively by the growth of the communist parties in their Popular Front periods, and more recently by the successes of such unitary attempts at the Brazilian Workers' Party and some other ones, etc. And it's also been reconfirmed negatively by the Trotskyist and Maoist squabbling sects. Now, on the other hand, in a certain sense, the European working class in 1914 through 18 paid the price of unity at all costs. It did so not at the outbreak of war when the leaders were carried along by the nationalisms of the mass of the class, but when the character of the war became clear, as the statist nationalist right wing held the whip hand over an anti-war left, which was afraid to split the movement. Rather similarly, Chinese workers in 1927, Spanish workers in 1937 through 39, French workers in 1940, Indonesian workers in 1965, and Chilean workers in 1973 paid a savage cost for the Communist Party's policy of unity at all costs. And
so let's stop there. We talked about that stuff so far. It's quite a lot there.
Yeah, that is quite a bit. So the first point, the happy point. Yeah, it's really nice when people can pool their resources. It's almost too obvious to mention, right? Like it's a majoritarian movement, right? Socialism. It has to be. Therefore, group hug, right? Why not? And the why not is much more difficult. But it has to do with this concept of the statist nationalist right wing holding a veto over anything happening in the workers' movement because you had such broad unity that you included them. And you didn't realize, because you're trying to smooth over your differences, that was going to sabotage any sense of international class unity. And not only will it sabotage international class unity, they will betray you as soon as they get the chance to throw you under the bus. So
yeah, it's kind of, if you look at our current politics, say in the UK and in America, you're seeing like the dominance of the right socialist, the soc dems or whatever you want to call it. So we're going to see this phase of current development of the left in our lifetime, you know, it's going to be a failure. You know, there's a lot of people in that came out of their left unity experiment from all these truck groups and communist groups that went into Momentum and into the Labour Party. But, you know, it's going to be drifted to the right, even if it's way to the left of where the Labour Party was. So, you know, if we're trying to think, when I read this stuff here, like I'm looking around at current things, I just think we're in a different phase. This idea of us getting towards this kind of snowball element of an actual radical left one, it's not this phase of 20-year political development. I don't see it. It's another phase beyond that. If anything, people will be able to see the failure. And this is one thing I think that people might actually learn as commies or socialists, is like waves of, you know, failures of the same strategy of going to try and take over a slightly left party with radicals. You know, it may take 5-10 phases of this strategy to fail before people actually seriously go back to a revolutionary one. What do people think about that?
That makes it all the more important for us to stand apart from those types. If you'll let me read one more paragraph, and I promise I'll stop.
No, which one?
It's the last one. I mean, it's not the last one, but it's the one that starts more immediately in the middle of 36. More than immediately, it is far from clear that the Goethe policy actually succeeded in overcoming the differences between the Eisenachers and the Lassalleans. And to put that in English, the Eisenachers were the wing of the SPD, like before they merged, that were more Marxist. I think Bebel was their leader, August Bebel. And then the Lassalleans were directly led by Ferdinand Lassalle. And those two factions came together to form the SPD at Goethe. By the 1890s, the SPD had escaped from illegality and reached a size at which attitudes to the state and to government participation became a live issue. The question of state, government, coalitions, and social strategy then resurfaced in debate in the SPD across the Second International and across the Second International. The questions were not posed in identical forms to the differences between Eisenachers and the Lassalleans, but their underlying principle was common. So yeah, this is basically a form of an original sin argument against orthodoxy. If you think about it, the whole question of the orthodoxy of the Second International is sort of undermined by their unity with what we'll be calling soon the right, the nationalist, statist, loyalist wing of the workers' movement. And I actually think we could probably leave it off here, because the next paragraph will start to get into next week's topic. What do you think?
That sounds about right.
We're all out of gas, right?
Never.
Well, I guess I just wanted to make one more point real quick. I've been thinking a lot about this kind of question of like distancing ourselves from like right-wing socialists and like the nationalists and all that kind of stuff. And it reminds me of the debate happening between Rosa and Lenin when Rosa was critiquing Lenin's what is to be done. She made the point that like no matter what you put, there's no words you could put in the Constitution that will make it so that there are these opportunities that come in. But that was basically all I wanted to say.
Well, when we wrap up, I think we've run out of steam. I think Grant has had some kind of a stroke. I'm certainly.
Exactly.
I'm certainly.
You know, it's McNair. You know, the thing about McNair for me is I like McNair. He's insightful. He makes good critiques of the 20th century. But you can only spend so much time with like the epitome of a socialist wonk, like with I might be my own, in my own space on that, but it just I do run out of steam. You're right.
No, well, I think I've run out of steam as well because we've been going for a long time.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. So will we finish up and we can take back we can go back to the last paragraph, last few bits of that next time. Will we say thanks to people in the chat or something?
Yeah. Let's throw it to
Does
the
anybody in the chat have anything we should like bullshit about really quick, or?
Oh man, there's a big chat this time.
That's like a big can of worms, maybe, but.
So, oh man, there's a lot of deleted Oh Man Damp. That is this guy. Jesus.
Sorry about.
Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we basically have had.
Yeah.
Go on, Lexi, you do it.
Oh no, they're making fun of our pronunciations in the chat. Well, good for you.
Did they answer whether I said Kalentai right?
I don't know. I think they're.
I don't think
know
so.
If they're literate in Russian. I think they're just Frenchies or something. Fucking frogs. Thanks to all the frogs in the chat. Sorry. We have Tom. Should we look for messages? Should we just shout out the people?
No. Let's just shout out here. I'll give it a quick.
Right.
Let's see at the top. We have Jara Handala, Max Wade, Tom O'Brien. He looks sexy. Tom Rowd, not as sexy. Our LDSJFK guy, who we won't give a full shout out at this time.
Yeah.
Who else do we have? Oman Damp causing grief in the chat, getting banned for the second time. It must be said. From a previous time. Erica is there. Erica Whelan, how's it going? Erica, and I think we've got Grant in there who didn't even know there was a chat. And Trans Revolution. Okay, we're all just reading out our own names. Anybody else? Dr. Forbin. A long time listener.
Oswald
Matthew
Spengler.
DX.
There's somebody here named Oswald Spengler that wants to message you with an off-topic question.
Oh boy.
Where is that?
Wee woo.
In the middle of the chat.
What timestamp?
Oh, let's see. That is a great question. Where the fuck is this person?
Click on the top bit and you can say toggle timestamps.
Just because I called the left reactionary doesn't mean I want to talk to you now.
Oh yeah. Hey, it's your boy Spengler in the house.
Spengler is a regular. Spengler is one of our regulars.
It's true, actually. Spengler's popped in every so often. I do wonder where they're coming from with that Star Spangler.
Okay.
I can't find it again. He's.
I think you're part of the same decrepit political architecture, Spengler.
Okay.
Please.
Spengler can.
All right, here we are. It's at 3:20.
Okay, 8:20. Yeah. Okay, I see it. Yeah. Spengler. Let me just say what's his name? As Oswald Spengler. Let's try that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So yes, Spengler. Oh, there we go. How does that work? Oh, Spengler.
There it is.
Oh yeah. Okay. I presume he's been edgy.
Oh, it's fine. We're for freedom of speech here on this podcast.
Oh, there's also Matthew DX.
Oh yeah, Matthew DX. I forgot about to finish with Matthew DX. We didn't even finish. We've had quite a lot in the chat today. Jesus, it's really going off.
Yeah.
But,
thanks for caring, people.
Yeah. So will we? Let's go offline and we'll see us all next week, and we can chat offline in a second ourselves. Thank you, group. Goodbye. Do we have a goodbye? Grant, are you able to speak?
I'm having trouble remembering certain. No, we shouldn't make this joke.
Your name.
Yeah, I can speak. Yeah.
Bye. Good luck, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. See you next.